And welcome everybody to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, February 27th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperature incendiaries and chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the presentation today. Best way to do it is just submit them in the questions and information forum, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and look for the actual live webinar under there, and there's a box you can enter them in. I'll also be taking a look at Facebook and YouTube for any insightful comments or questions there, so you can try to put them on there as well. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it so much. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the San Francisco Bay Area here. More recently, before launching full-time under this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects and engineers and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And that's why we now have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. We just keep going and going and going. We use the scientific method at AE911 Truth. It's been around for 100 years. It's the way we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We have a question, what brought the towers down? We do background research, make observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to what brought the towers down. Maybe it was the planes. Maybe it was fire, maybe explosions, or some combination of these. Controlled demolition, possibly. We'll be looking at lots of evidence for that today. We test these hypotheses with experiments. We draw conclusions after analyzing the results. And if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated, that is supported by the evidence, the background research, and so forth. With that in mind, let's look and see and do some background research. For instance, fires have certainly destroyed several buildings, never a high-rise before 9/11. Causing it to collapse completely. But say in a wood frame building, it's an organic process. There's only enough fuel to burn in a given area. Say even in a modern high-rise, 20 or 30 minutes. That's about it. So the fire moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building collapses due to fire, it's usually falls to the path of least resistance, falling over, not straight down through the tons of structural supporting framework underneath. So this is extremely important, and we have a case history of fires in steel buildings, but only under test procedures. In fact, the largest test of its kind in 1995 in the UK, where they had lots and lots of fuel, achieving 2,000 degree fires, which is really difficult to do. Let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. So this is a rather an incredible opportunity for us in the 9/11 studies to see what has brought structures down. And not even in this non-fireproofed building did it collapse due to fire. So as an important precedent for NIST to have covered, which they didn't adequately review at all. The beams begin to sag, and that's about it. There's no collapse. The connections maintain their integrity through even the hottest of fires, and even when they're not fireproofed, such as these particular beams in that test. And this particular structure, which did not collapse due to a fire, but only sagged, which is more typical. There have been some factories that have collapsed due to fires. They're not fire protected. They have huge fuel loads. There's other buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The buildings fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the intact, cold, hard structure below. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. The building is recognizable as such in the aftermath. It's not, doesn't fall like a house of cards where you can hardly recognize that it was a building, like we'll see today in the case of the Twin Towers. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of smoke and pulverized building materials that are expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredibly hot gases from the ignition of explosives. We have also witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. It's not difficult to distinguish a building that has been exploded versus one that has collapsed. The solid edge of this increasingly rapidly expanding cloud, it's a very defined solid edge, in this case due to the rapid expansion from the heat. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite efficiently to bring buildings down by placing cutter charges in the buildings, bringing them down as you see here, set synchronistically timed floor by floor and set against the columns, specific locations in the building where the columns and beams are severed one from another. That's how the building is able to fall nearly at free fall, and often in a symmetrical fashion, if that's what they want to achieve. So there's a set of features associated with controlled demolitions, beginning with a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. A straight down symmetrical collapse, if that's what they're wanting to achieve, into the building's footprint, usually. Because there's a patterned removal of column supports. That's how you bring a building down symmetrically, which results in a free fall acceleration, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of steel or concrete in the way, resulting also in the total dismemberment, therefore, of the structural steel frame or concrete. Limited damage, of course, to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature number 7, a patterned explosions that are heard by witnesses, flashes of light that are seen by them. Broken up concrete floors, certainly. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. You don't want to have to go in and jackhammer those floors which have fallen at all odd angles. Very dangerous work. We break that floor up. Feature number 9, explosive charges visible at many of the floors. And then chemical evidence left behind of these explosive devices, of course, in the aftermath. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of it is achievable by fires, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse, and when they do so, it's asymmetrical with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance, typically. At least those fires that have brought buildings down, but we haven't lost a high-rise due to fire before 9/11, and many, many dozens and dozens of examples of much hotter, larger, and longer-lasting fires like these.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
They're not collapsing, not even this one, World Trade Center 5, as you saw. If any of the World Trade Center fires were to bring down a building, it would have been this one, fully engulfed, right? No, mid-rise, high-rise, fire-protected structures don't collapse, and not until 9/11. And why not? Well, we have the steel, thousands of tons of heat sink, basically drawing that heat away from its source. So it keeps the steel from ever getting to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, a critical temperature at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. And so to keep that from happening, just in case, we also fireproof these steel frame elements with 2 hours on the beams and 3 hours on the columns in high-rise buildings. That's 3-hour fire protection. That's 6 times more fire protection than is needed to get to get the occupants out of the building safely. As we mentioned, the fire only lasts 30 minutes also. So it's 6 times more protection than is needed to protect the building from such a fire. Any office fire in a modern high-rise, anyway. Non-combustible buildings are also the way we protect buildings. We don't build high-rises out of wood, for instance, or other combustible materials. And we regulate very carefully what the tenants can bring in to those buildings. We don't have large fuel loads, just some desks and chairs and things like that. And to keep all that from becoming a problem anyway, we sprinkler these high rises so they don't, any fire would be put out immediately. So extra safety involved in these. In the case of the Twin Towers, the sprinkler systems were said to have been compromised by the impact of the planes. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation or foreknowledge of these events, you know when a controlled demolition is going to happen. Typically, you have to get approvals from government, so people know there's advanced knowledge, and experts agree. At least those experts who don't have financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion as to what might or might not be a controlled demolition, such as Twin Towers. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition, proof which we will apply to the Twin Towers. And beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, we looked at this last week in part 2 of this series. If you missed it, I encourage you to dig it up on YouTube, search 9/11, An Architect's Guide, part 2, because we saw that there was a sudden onset of destruction. We saw patterned explosions and flashes of light. We saw straight down symmetrical progression outside the building's footprint. We saw ejections of materials, structural steel beams at all kinds of floors, and isolated explosive ejections called squibs. We saw a near free fall acceleration straight down through the thousands of tons of structural steel that's cold, hard, and intact, and yet it didn't even slow down. And we saw the total shattering of the structural steel frame, which the NFPA Guide 921 says to look for. We'll come back to that guide today. We also saw the lateral ejection of structural steel sections weighing 4 to 8 tons, ejected 600 feet at 60 to 80 miles an hour, and pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete, 190,000 tons of pulverized concrete in each tower, distributed outside the footprint of the building. We found that there's nothing left to crush the building. This was all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Again, fire doesn't create these features. And so today we're going to be starting with features number 8, 9, and 10 in part 3 of this series, beginning with pyroclastic-like clouds of extremely hot materials, which the National Fire Protection Guide 921 for investigation of fire and explosions says, look for thermal effects. Well, what do you mean? Well, the large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, like we see in every photo and video of the Twin Towers after the first couple of seconds. Expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. An incredible expansion, which creates it was created by a whole lot more heat than we have available to us at the time of the collapse, which with these few diminishing fires in each of the towers indicated by the thick black smoke that they're oxygen starved and cooler fires. Where is all that heat coming to produce those incredible expansion of those clouds? Something like this is what it would more take. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. What is creating all of this heat as we look at the persistent heat and extreme heat as documented by Massimo Mazzucco in his famous DVD, 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out? There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down. 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Worksite, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
This is extraordinary, actually. We have the first responders saying, remember red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile several weeks after the collapse. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping from molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of another cleanup company and president of Controlled Demolition, Inc. Molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are both video and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A river of steel flowing, says who? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, a direct witness, and his associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. as you see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to the South Tower's demise. NIST says, well, this must be melted airplane. Well, molten aluminum looks silvery in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow yellow or orange like you saw there. And as you see here, glowing molten metal falling out of the material held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator, and is documented by the architect tasked with collecting souvenirs. They called them meteorites.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And molten concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. And yet at 3,200 degrees, it does. In the Police Museum in New York, this is still there. Direct evidence of something much, much hotter than jet fuel or office fires can achieve. Flowed like lava around everything in its path, including this handgun in the police department in Building 6 of World Trade Center. Partially evaporated steel beams. Members in the debris pile appear to have been evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says the author of the FEMA report, which we'll come to in a moment, Dr. Jonathan Barnett. But guess what? It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. So now we have evidence of 4,000 degree temperatures melting the girders at the World Trade Center, says Abu Hassan Astani Azal, UC Berkeley professor who had a contract to study the steel under the National Science Foundation grant. He doesn't know what melted it. He doesn't seem to care. He says, if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with the clocks that are kind of melted, it's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees, not realizing that fires don't get that hot in office fires or jet fuel. And this incredible effect and phenomena of this material on the structural steel sections, deformation. Back to Massimo Mazzucca.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Well, it's getting interesting now. 2,800 degrees to melt steel, and yet FEMA, the first official report on the World Trade Center destruction, in their Appendix C, documents a metallurgical examination, the results thereof, in the Building Performance Assessment Report, citing a 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness. Its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. How does this happen? It doesn't happen by normal office fires or jet fuel. Jet fuel is just basically kerosene, as we'll see. It has a maximum burning temperature of any other hydrocarbon. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting cited by FEMA in this report. Liquid iron, that's molten iron. sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. But no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified, according to NIST. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, but it's completely omitted in the NIST report. The presence of sulfur is very well documented. Where does it come from? Well, NIST speculates years later in a frequently asked question on their website, very frequently. Sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in interior partitions. Wait a minute. Gypsum wallboard has been used for 100 years to protect steel. It's never turned around and attacked it. This is absolutely ludicrous on the part of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Besides, you can do experiments, as John Cole did in his backyard in Florida. This civil engineer put all kinds of broken up gypsum wallboard against this beam and had 2,000-degree fires and no attack on the steel whatsoever. Yet the smell of sulfur permeated. Where was it coming from? It burned. That smell of sulfur, says John Field of the Feel Good Foundation, a hero and iron worker at the site. Well, what does NIST say? John Gross, the co-project leader of the NIST report, has this to say about all this material.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled up a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Says who? Leslie Robertson, the designer of the structural steel system for the World Trade Center complex. But John Gross actually hand-picked the very piece of steel from a beam from World Trade Center Building 7, the third tower to collapse on 9/11. If you missed that part of our three-part series, be sure to dig it up on YouTube. Also, just look for 9/11, An Architect's Guide, Part 1. The very piece of steel. And he denies the evidence of this strange phenomena, but his shadow is all over it. So we ask ourselves, well, how hot is the fire? Well, the fire is maybe 1,200 degrees at the most, according to some supporters of the official story like Thomas Iger. NIST claims 1,800 degrees without any evidence to suggest otherwise. But even so, hydrocarbons only burn 600 and 1,400 degrees. Jet fuel burns 600 degrees maximum in open air, according to ME Petroleum, one of the key manufacturers of jet fuel. Again, it's basically kerosene. Doesn't burn up your lamp, your kerosene lamp. So steel had definitely melted, as we've seen. And as you can see here, you can tell by the temperature of this material falling out of the crab claw excavator molten material. By its color, you can tell its temperature, up to 2,500 degrees in this case. That's just the physics of molten metals. So what caused the steel to melt? This is incredible. NIST actually has another speculation that came out years later in a very frequently asked question that they posted on their website. Any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile, rather than short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Yeah, well, guess what? Conservation of energy, it's a law. And we abide by it in physics. In a closed system, such as fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it is burning. It doesn't work that way. You can only convert energy you have from one form to another. So the heat is dissipated. It starts out hot. So what got it hot? That's the question we're going to be looking at here as we ask ourselves, is there evidence of something that could get it hotter? For instance, thermite. Could it have produced all that molten metal? Well, let's go to some information about what is thermite anyway.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the presence of extreme heat, producing up to 4,000 degrees. It would also explain the presence of elemental iron, which we will see is present throughout all the World Trade Center. Dust, if you will, powdered materials, pulverized concrete. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Well, the NFPA 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite and other pyrotechnic materials. Interesting. We have extreme heat that said, look for thermal effects. Now it's saying, look for incendiaries. NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. They write back to us from our request for correction, which we submitted in 2007. But a year later, they write back to another inquiry, citing NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue, after claiming that they didn't find any. No wonder they didn't find any. You can't find what you're not looking for, or won't. Others did, however. One of them was Professor Stephen Jones, physicist, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University. He says, well, gosh, thermite would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Would also produce a white cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising up off the yellow molten material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. And like we see following these freely flying 4-ton structural steel sections issued laterally back to, this is ejected laterally. We talked about that in part 2 of this series last week. Here, we note what is trailing this 4-ton structural steel section. Steel is not flammable under office fire or jet fuel conditions. Wood is, steel is not. How did the ends of the steel beams become so engulfed in heat that they're trailing thick white smoke clouds? Looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea. There's thousands of these ejections. A geometry of fireworks. What's really going on here? Look at both of these towers. They collapse in virtually the same way. It's more like a waterfall, an ejection of structural steel materials, as we saw last week, all outside the footprint. So we found that the steel wasn't crushing the building. It was ejected outside the footprint, 99% of it. The concrete was also landed in a pulverized powder outside the footprint. So neither, which comprises 2/3 of the weight of this building, could have been involved in collapsing the building. Were they really on fire? Listen.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
Steel sections of beams literally on fire. How does steel catch on fire in an office fire or with jet fuel? Stephen Jones says it could leave behind, thermite would leave behind unique chemical evidence, common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements on the periodic table of the elements. He sent a piece of this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal by somebody who heard about the work that he was doing. He does electron microprobe data, finding that it's predominantly iron. So it's not aluminum from the jet plane. It has abundant manganese. So he rules out molten structural steel. So it's not even really melted steel. It has abundant aluminum, sulfur, potassium, the residue of thermite. But even more revealing, manganese and fluorine in abundance. Where do they come from? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges, very special thermite charges. So these are often present in the residue and are part of a thermite fingerprint, according to Stephen Jones. But sol-gels would also leave an additional residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. The EPA analysis of the dust finds a molecule that at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Another sample from this sculpture in Manitoba at the Peace Park was sent to Stephen Jones. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis, finding iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, aluminum, the ingredients of ignited thermite in the ends, from the slag and the ends of the beam. You can make your own thermite cutter charges in your backyard, as John Cole, civil engineer, also did. You have to have a shaped cutter charge, so to force the liquid molten iron that's expanding through the structural steel, as you see here.
The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Where did we see that before? Oh yeah, in the FEMA Appendix C report that was issued in 2002 that NIST threw out when they took over the investigation, having issued their final report in 2004 or 5. It wasn't there. They simply got rid of the evidence here, apparently. There are devices that are much more sophisticated than the one you just saw that were patented prior to 9/11 that issue molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective at cutting through thicker sections of structural steel. And why would the perpetrators who are responsible for this crime of the century want to use thermite instead of the typical high energy explosives like C4 or RDX? Well, they provide an extremely loud bang, a series of them, of course, and bright flashes, which would want to be avoided. Those audio and visual signatures would be a dead giveaway. So apparently this was chosen as a more subtle means of bringing down the towers. There are devices that are used that have their casing itself made out of consolidated thermite. It's consumed. All that's left is molten metal, which was everywhere, as you've already seen, according to the witnesses. But what else was found in the fine powder so ubiquitous on 9/11 that we looked into detail at that powder itself? But in the powder, last week we did, in the powder, the U.S. Geological Survey, not conspiracy theorists out there, but one of the largest, most respected scientific agencies we have in the United States, in their particle atlas in 2005, find billions of previously molten iron microspheres. All that's really important. This is molten iron that has been aerosolized, as we'll see. Up to 6% of the dust is composed of these previously molten iron microspheres, amounting to about 4 tons of molten iron. Not the meteorites, but in the World Trade Center dust in these small spheres that the R.J. Lee Group, an independent environmental consulting firm, also finds. Says, wait, this is not background iron dust. They also say this is not formed before the event or after the event, but during the event. These became molten, became aerosolized, and cooled, and fell with all of the dust. They're so prevalent that they're used as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. How does that happen? Well, here's a controlled experiment with thermite under controlled conditions. You see what looks like thousands of sparks, slowing it down halfway. What you realize that these are molten iron droplets that cool and fall in the pan. When you aerosolize a liquid, it forms itself by surface tension into a sphere. Could that be responsible for what's toasting the tops of these cars surrounding the World Trade Center? Can you come up with any other rational explanation in this extreme heat event? But what else was found in all that World Trade Center dust? A team of international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collected independently 7 samples. They were sent to them, like the one from this apartment across the street from the South Tower, owned by Jeanette McKinley, who was an artist. Her windows blew in, her apartment filled with dust. She collected this in an effort to overcome her own personal trauma. She was in the apartment, to use in her artwork. And she paid for that, unfortunately, that decision with her life, succumbing to brain cancer. But hers is one of these 4 samples documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. What do they find? They get real curious because it's attracted by a magnet. That's extremely important. Paint is not attracted by a magnet. So they do deeper analysis and find through X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy that the red layer is composed of iron, aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, unignited ingredients of thermite, elemental iron, which is iron oxide in this case, which is basically rust. So they get real curious. What's thermite doing in these chips, which look like paint? Red on one side, gray on the other. They're dual layered. So they zoom into the red layer 50,000 times with an electron microscope and find what? Nanoparticles of iron oxide crystals. This is not normal rust. And aluminum platelets at the nanoscale, set in a bed of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic materials responsible for the gas expansion in TNT. So here we clearly have incendiary materials, thermite, combined with organic material. In fact, the peer-reviewed literature shows that this material is called super thermite, and they, at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit, it ignites in a differential scanning calorimeter, a heater, basically. What happens when it ignites? Well, the same thing happens to these 4 samples. They ignite 420 degrees centigrade. When they ignite, they produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical configuration as the molten iron microspheres that were found in the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips, these red-gray chips, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, we have a self-corroborating, consistent set of repeatable experimental data that can be introduced into a court of law, which we're doing as we speak and have been trying to do for a number of years, to bring perpetrators, the real perpetrators, to justice. We don't know who the real perpetrators are. There's some books on this subject. You might check out Another 19 Suspects by Kevin Ryan. And Solving 9/11, Christopher Bollin. But this material is extremely sophisticated. You see, when it gets to the nanoscale, chemical materials, their volume increases exponentially. They become the chemical reaction is almost instantaneous. So they become more explosive just for that reason alone. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. So we know where to investigate, if there's the will to investigate, from journalists, criminal investigators, governmental agencies that are not doing their job, the media, which is not doing its job. We've given this report to every congressperson 4 times. They are not doing their job. The 25-page peer-reviewed paper on this subject. So what you're seeing here is direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries today. We looked at explosives last week. This is not evidence of destruction from fire, especially these fires, which are virtually out at the time of the collapse. And as you can see in the thermal imaging from NASA satellite, NASA camera, are only showing temperatures about 200 degrees Fahrenheit in this case. What do the experts say? There's 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 911 Truth, demanding a new investigation. Ron Brookman is one of them. It doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Fire protection engineer, also on the petition. Fires were weak, says Edward Munyak. NIST reports they confirm that steel temperatures were low. The collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. What about the evidence? Surely it was preserved, protected in easily the three most puzzling structural failures and largest in modern history. Let's see. Let's listen to Abolhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer from UC Berkeley, tasked with finding out what happened by the National Science Foundation.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
The evidence of the steel went to China for recycling? Before investigators could get their hands on it and do a thorough investigation. Yeah, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, crucial evidence that could answer the many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, we have 400 trucks per day carting that steel out to these barges. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. And that started just 2 weeks after 9/11 with Building 7 steel. So, using the scientific method, which hypothesis is corroborated? These buildings come down by jet planes, fire, explosions, controlled demolition. Have we shown today three additional characteristic, actually very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Not typical at all. Last week we showed the first 7 uncharacteristic and some characteristic features of controlled demolition. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony by videos and witnesses, we find that this is proof of controlled demolition, at least proof to 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. And that's why we're bringing it to your attention, because again, this is not just about buildings, is it? The implications of the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers, in addition to being mass murder, it's treason. And let's face it, who really had access to these types of materials? Who had access to the Twin Towers? These are some critical questions that are not being answered. You might have your own questions today. Andy, how do people ask questions to us today? We want to answer some of these.
All right, thank you. So please submit your questions that you might have in the same input form we were talking about earlier. That's if you go to ae911truth.org, go under continuing education and look for the live webinar. Under that, you can submit them right in the box and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, right now, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you. And your questions go right here, as Andy suggested. do subscribe while you're on our website. You'll get the latest evidence that we're putting together, our efforts legally and politically to get a real investigation. So just put it takes like literally a minute, not even that. Just put your name and email address. You can get informed on our website. Also have an incredible evidence section. If you're an architect or engineer, please sign the petition. Join 3,000 architects and engineers. If you're not, join the 20,000 others that are supporting them. You don't have to be an architect or engineer, nor do you to donate to our cause. We are all over the country in conventions, and we're going to DC again next month to give the presentation on the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 to a major university there, with the final report from the Halsey report, which we'll be telling you about in a moment, from the University of Alaska, proving that fires didn't bring down Building 7. So that's the kind of work we're doing, and this is where you can help us on our website. It's real easy. And a cup of coffee a day from 1,000 people enables us to do the work that we're doing. We have a handful of staff that are trying to survive, and we need to support them to support me to go out and give these presentations. You can do that by becoming a member of AE 9/11 Truth, joining the family of 9/11 Truth supporters, with the tip of the spear of the 9/11 Truth movement, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. We can't do it alone. We can't do it without you, and we don't do it alone. We have how many volunteers do we have, Andy, helping us here?
Oh, probably like 15 really good ones who are just hard at work all the time. People who are, basically whenever they're always looking for something to do, and they're just the go-to people in certain areas and always deliver. So I want more of those types of folks out there. And if you feel you're one of those folks, you got a few hours a week and you're really dedicated, and you just dive right into a job and don't quit until it's done. We want you. So the best way to do that is go to ae911truth.org. There's a contact form right there, and it's for volunteers. It's very easy to fill out, easiest job application you'll ever find. Just tell us a few things about yourself and your contact info. We'll call you, figure out where best you will fit. Typically, it's where you want to fit. And we'll put you to work, and you can do so many things. Even if you're a person who doesn't like to talk very much, keeps to yourself, we got work for you there. And if you're more outgoing and like to talk on the phone, we'll have work for you there as well. So you'll find out more when you talk to me, but the first step is volunteering. So please do that if you've been thinking about it for a long time.
And if you're a loner, and I say that in a good sense, you can work on your own. Just reach out to your local elected representative. Send them the ae911truth.org link, our other materials, links to our videos, this video, for instance. Television, radio, newspaper representatives need to know this. Everybody does. Every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know. Send them the AE911 Truth DVDs. Share them and the brochures that we have in our store. You can get 100 of them and pass them out. Do tabling events. You can let them know about the World Trade Center 7 evaluation that has been completed now and is being published the month of March. At the end of March, we will have this final report proving that the World Trade Center 7 did not come down due to fire, that it would have taken the destruction of every column over an 8-story section of the building virtually all at once, starting with the core columns, and then within a second, the perimeter columns. So all of this work has been done, and that is the essential findings. And that's why we have, by the way, now 5 fire commissioners from a New York area city unanimously supporting a resolution, passing a resolution calling for a new investigation of these 3 towers. And we also have an incredible opportunity for you to get involved with your congressman with the McIlvaine Act. Andy, could you tell us a little about that?
Absolutely. This is Bobby McIlvaine. He died at the World Trade Center on the morning of September 11th. He was actually killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower that day. So for that reason, Bob McIlvaine, his father, has been an outspoken advocate for a new investigation. And he's worked with us for a number of years. And we named this legislation after him, the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is draft legislation. And what it would do is it would set up a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for years before this was created, which is look into the destruction of these buildings and actually look at the real possibility of explosive demolition that day. It's actually written in the bill that they have to look into the evidence Richard's been presented. So we just got to find at least one heroic member of Congress that will do that. Now that might seem like an oxymoron, hearing heroic member of Congress, but members of Congress only react when they hear from their constituents. So you got to do that as a part of your daily ritual, or at least weekly ritual. The first step is go to ae911truth.org/justice, learn about the bill, learn the evidence. Is watching these webinars you're doing. You can print out the bill from that webpage, and there's a letter from Bob attached to it, a letter from Richard. You go to your town hall. It's a lot of fun. Make your congressman nervous by asking him about this publicly, and then hand them this information afterwards. And if they give you any trouble, then please tell us about it, because I love to report this stuff on my podcast. But you do that, you can contact them, just pick up the phone and tell their assistants who have to pass these on and keep a record of what people are talking about. And you can also fill out a very quick form that generates a letter. You don't even have to write it yourself. We've already done it for you. That once you put your contact information in, it goes right to your representatives. There's a number of simple things that you can do to help get this legislation passed. And I actually heard it during a radio show during the World War II era. It was war propaganda, but it applies to our movement too. It's small things done well every day are going to be what wins the war for us. And I apply that to 9/11 Truth movements. These are some small things you can do well every day to get us further towards our goal of justice with the Bobby McIlvaine Act. So please do them.
Now, when Andy talks about his podcast, he's talking about 9/11 Freefall, the famous radio program that has all kinds of fascinating guests. Andy, could you tell us about the podcast real quick, and then some of your recent guests?
Sure. The simplest way to find out about it is go to the website, 911freefall.com. You can listen to episodes, download them, listen to them while you're doing something else. But we've had excellent guests. Of course, first and foremost, we have people like Richard come on, talk about the amazing developments that happen here at AE. We have members of our board who are engineers, architects, really smart people who have been doing a lot, like Roland Engel, who leads the project due diligence. And he utilizes these volunteers to go out and give presentations. When they do, I bring them on and they talk about it, not just the evidence, which you can get from these webinars, but they talk about the nitty gritty, about interactions that they had. You get some of the personal stories. We got some great activists out there in the 9/11 movement doing some great things. We got writers who have written on this topic and they relate it to other topics. This week we had Daniel Ganser on, very smart guy. I feel like I come away a little bit smarter from each show, just from being around these people and learning a bunch of new facts. So you can as well. And we're on a couple of different radio stations, No Lies Radio and BBS Radio. But yeah, you want to check it out, listen, it's 911freefall.com.
Yeah, and Andy has interviewed the members of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry who have taken our evidence in 60 exhibits and submitted them to U.S. Attorney, who has agreed to comply with the law requiring him to hand this material over to a special grand jury. And we have filed a mandamus action to force them to do just that at this point, and we're waiting for the judge to let us know what's going on there. In the case of the FBI lawsuit, we are suing the FBI because they have not given to Congress the evidence that we have given them, which you've seen today. And they were required to do so by law, by a congressional act called the 2015 9/11 Review Commission. And Mick Harrison and Dave Meiswinkel have always also been on Andy's radio show, updating people about this this lawsuit, which we've now filed, we're getting ready to file an appeal. So it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. We're bound and determined. So stand by for that. And know that we have a landmark documentary that you also are going to want to watch. I'll give you just a couple of minutes of taste of this before we get to your questions. But here we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence themselves directly from the horse's mouth. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch this for free on YouTube. The 1-hour version and the 90-minute version, which I highly recommend, is available in our store. It also has extended interviews with these experts, an extraordinary learning experience, as is the 50-page booklet, beyondmisinformation.org, which you can download for free at beyondmisinformation.org. The booklet's called Beyond Misinformation. So the 2-hour version of this presentation is available also on YouTube, and as is the 15-minute video for you, narrated by Ed Asner, professionally produced for PBS, played on PBS, and it's 5-minute version, but you get all 15 minutes here for free. Hey, I think we have some questions. Isn't that true, Andy?
Yes, we started off with just one, but we got 2 more at the last minute here. So this first one is pretty long, so bear with me. It says, NIST investigators and experts from the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Structural Engineers Association of New York, who inspected the steel at Ground Zero and the salvage yards, said there is no evidence that would support the melting of steel from jet fuel ignited fires prior to the collapse. NIST said the condition of the steel in the wreckage of the towers, whether it was in a molten state or not, was irrelevant because it does not provide any conclusive evidence on the condition of the steel in the wreckage of the towers, whether it was in a molten state or not. Was irrelevant because it does not provide any conclusive evidence on the condition of the steel when the towers were standing. How can NIST say finding molten steel is meaningless when at the same time admitting that they were not interested in testing for other extreme sources of heat? And how can NIST say the molten material pouring from the South Tower had to be aluminum mixed with office materials without confessing to us that this is just mere grasping at straws speculation? That's a mouthful, but that's the question.
Yeah, it sure is. There's a lot here. These questions that point out the hypocrisy of NIST are exceptional, and we need to collect these, like you said last time, Andy. They're extraordinary. NIST can't get away with this. Well, let's say they can get away with this if there's only a few people questioning it, and it appears to be the case. We submitted an RFC in 2007 on this subject and several others. NIST is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they are unable to explain away the vast evidence of extreme heat that can't be explained by fires, that can't be explained by jet fuel. And so they deny it. The co-project leader denies this evidence. They deny, they don't publish any of the evidence of incendiaries whatsoever. And yet it's there even in their in some of their the photographs have extreme heat in the form of expanding clouds, which can only be produced by thousands of degrees and incredible heat energy, which is unexplainable in the fires, as you saw. So they overlook the evidence of molten iron microspheres. They overlook the evidence of incendiaries in the form of red-gray chips in the dust that you saw today. They try to explain away the molten material that has been brought to their attention, but which they do not produce on their website, but yet was produced by FEMA, their predecessor, in the Appendix C of the FEMA report, quite carefully in this metallurgical examination, documenting hot corrosion attack on the steel, intergranular melting, molten iron, none of which can be accounted for by any of the elements of the official story. Andy, you might have something to add to this.
I have really nothing to add. We get a lot of great questions that are a bit rhetorical, but they point out the hypocrisy of NIST, as Richard had said. So I want to get the person who is writing these questions and Shyam Sunder in a room. I have a feeling Sunder would be in tears by the time we checked in on them again, but that is a good thing. So I think we should be sending these to NIST, and it's a project that's hanging out there, but at some point we're going to do that. So keep these questions coming. The next question says, has anyone looked into those companies that were doing elevator fixes and or upgrades weeks, months before 9/11?
Yes, we have some talented researchers looking into Ace Elevator. What they found was that they're tied to the mafia, and they didn't want to go further. So, I mean, I guess we can toy with NIST and poke the bear, but we haven't been attacked yet. I have gotten no threats or anything, but apparently when you get into Ace Elevator, it gets a little thicker on the private sector. So Ace Elevator, of course, is the company that was hired to retrofit the elevators in the World Trade Center. They had the contract 9 months, for the 9 months prior to 9/11, had complete access to the core columns and beams through the elevator hoistways and the gypsum board enclosures, access to those columns to do what they needed to do in there. So they fled on when the jet planes hit the towers, not helping, staying to help the firefighters. It was rescue the victims. It was quite a scandal documented in USA Today. The elevator modernization itself was documented in March 2001 Elevator World. So lots of opportunity in an undercover operation to do this work. Of course, Ace Elevator came out of nowhere to get this contract from Otis Elevator, who had installed and had been maintaining these elevators up to the time of Ace Elevator's retrofit. So let's see. Yeah, I hope that helps. Andy, you know anything else about Ace?
Actually, I think you know a little bit more than me here. That's the first time I'm hearing about mafia connections. So certainly something to look into. But I know about Ace and I know about their work beforehand, and certainly someone to look at in all of this.
Wait, Andy, if anyone wants to pick up where this gentleman left off, write to me, and we'll get you the information that we have, and maybe you're a little more less concerned about retribution in all of its ugly forms.
All right, our last question says, I'm not sure this is an actual question, but when watching the Twin Towers collapse, I noticed recently that before they start to enter free fall or near free fall, the part of the building above the plane impact sites begins to lean, as if the weakened structural steel has led to the situation where the part of the building above the impact site is about to fall over. So I guess I'm just wondering if anyone else has noticed this, that the controlled demolition aspect could be in part to prevent, and I didn't finish the question, so let me finish this. Bear with me for 1 second. I only pasted part of the question. So I'll just reiterate. So I guess I'm just wondering if anyone else has noticed this, that the controlled demolition aspect could be in part to prevent the tops of the buildings above the impact site from toppling over. The buildings begin to collapse at the exact time the top begins to topple to the side. That's what I've seen. To me, this is great evidence for controlled demolition.
Interesting. There are two phases, at least, to both towers. There's the point of jet plane impacts in the case of the North Tower, which is 15 stories down. In the case of the South Tower, it's about 30 stories down. In each case, there's a smooth, sudden descent without impact, without jolting, without hesitation, indicating that the structure below the point of jet plane impacts has been taken out. Otherwise, it would impact, halt, and perhaps even fall over. But with a smooth, sudden descent, there is a leaning. So my personal speculation is that they didn't have the charges placed completely symmetrically or synchronistically timed correctly, such that there's some leaning. I'm guessing they were supposed to go down symmetrically. They certainly didn't seem to want to have these towers fall off and destroy much larger sections than were destroyed below. So in the first phase, you have the liquefying of the structure, the shattering of the structure, which is one of the points that the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says to look for, the shattering of the structure. Well, there it is, a shattering, proof that is shattering. That's proof of controlled demolition all by itself. When we compare that in week 2 of this series to controlled demolitions of high rises, they look exactly the same. Now, after that top part begins to lean, and in the case of the south tower, even rights itself, because it just doesn't know where it's going because there's not two solid blocks colliding. The solidity has been removed, obviously, by explosions, which are visibly seen all around the building and heard and documented by witnesses, 156 firefighters, as we talked about in last week's series. So phase 2 begins after about 4 seconds. The first part, the upper part of the building has been destroyed. After that, you have laterally freely flying structural steel sections, 4 and 8 ton, as we talked about, landing 600 feet in every direction. And the building begins to look like a waterfall of explosions and these white clouds trailing, thick white smoke clouds trailing these structural steel members that are somehow on fire. And then that's the way it proceeds all the way down to the ground. That's phase 2. So the evidence for controlled demolition is in each phase. And I think what the questioner is referring to here is that the transition between the phases also. And I don't quite understand the point there. Maybe I got to it. I'm not sure. Andy, what do you think?
I'm not. I'd have to look over the question again. I don't know if they're claiming that they brought down the towers for a safety reason because the top block started to fall into the plaza below. I mean, because you can't just rig it in a day, especially the Twin Towers, to come down because of some safety concern after 9/11 happened. You had to know what was going to happen beforehand, and they don't just rig buildings to come down in advance just in case something happens. That's not very safe. So, but it's a great point bringing up the turning of the top block, because there's been other people that have noticed that as well. So please just keep on noticing things about 9/11, watch the news footage, and if you pick up something that we don't, then we'll be very happy with you and feature it.
Yeah, and keep those great questions coming. And I guess that's the last one for today. Is that right, Andy?
Yep, that is it. So that concludes the webinars for February. We'll be doing them again in March.
And this was part 3, Twin Towers in Extreme Heat. Last week we looked at part 2, Twin Towers explosive destruction. And guess what? It starts all over again in March. As Andy mentioned, on the first Thursday in March, 1 p.m. Pacific, we have the Building 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11, wasn't hit by an airplane, and yet it collapsed in under 7 seconds symmetrically at free fall. So be sure to come look at that. If you can't wait, go to YouTube and Google 9/11 An Architect's Guide Part 1, and you can watch it yourself. Until next week, we've been real happy to be here, Andy and I, and we'll see you guys. Keep asking your questions. We'll see if we can get to them. Until next week, thanks and bye for now.